I'd go from bronze to mythic. If I could only open some rares.
That's freaking terrible.
But we'll work hard to solve the format.
7 wins.
And I'm sure we'll make it there.
All right, what is up, my friends? Welcome to a very, very special and unique episode of Bronze to Mythic. We're going to call this episode 17.5, and kind of serendipitously worked out really well, where my internet's still screwed up, and it really delayed the series a lot, but because it delayed the series, now we get to do something that's never been done before on Bronze to Mythic, or in Limited ever, for the first time ever in life.
Oh, God.
We got a rebalance for a limited format. Now, of course, part of the benefit of Alchemy or digital-only designs on Magic Arena is that they can go in and just change them. And they're not printed cards, so just go in and fix stuff that's weird. And there are definitely some imbalances in this format for sure. So they have rebalanced 27 cards. Some are buffs, some are nerfs, with the intent of making blue a little better because it's by far the worst color, and toning down white a little bit because it was by far the best color. So let's get past the constructed changes here. It doesn't matter to us here on Bronze to Mythic. Draft changes, go read this at your leisure. We're going to jump right in and start looking at the cards here and seeing the slight changes and how they're going to affect things for Bronze to Mythic going forward. I'm still in Platinum. The series is still going to continue. And all future episodes will be with these new changes, which is awesome. So I rushed out the episodes before this to make sure we can get to this point because I'm really, really excited to play a rebalanced format. It's really, really cool. So first up is Dragonborn Looter. And this change has more effect in Historic than in Draft, I think. Dragonborn Looter was a 2-mana 1-2, pay 1 to loot. Now it's the exact same card, it just costs 1 blue instead of 2. This is obviously an upgrade. However, a 1-mana 1-2 is not exactly super exciting. I don't really actually love looters in Limited. They're fine, and they're good and long if the games go really long to like filter away your lands. But in more like rampy decks, you kind of want your lands and your spells. They don't really do very much unless you're like really flooding or really mana screwed. So I'm not a big looter fan unless you're using the graveyard. There are some graveyard things in black, which is kind of cool. Maybe that could be a cool deck, but I think this card's still kind of eh. It goes from being like not that playable to slightly playable, but I think in Historic, as a side note, I think it's actually going to be a playable card in Historic, but we'll get to that. So slight change here, nothing super great. Next change is another slight change here in Pseudo Dragon Familiar. I promise you there are more exciting changes going forward. The first few are a little basic. So we see a change here. The Familiar goes from being a 2-1 flyer to a 2-2 flyer, otherwise exactly the same. Windrake's still not that good. Kind of cool. It doesn't walk into Pilgrim's Eye anymore. It can block 1/1s or whatever. But for the most part, this card's still a card you don't really want in your deck overall. Water Weird, kind of the same thing, honestly. Water Weird gained the ability 2 mana to give it +1/-1. I mean, the problem with this card is it's just kind of like a clunky, mopey ground creature anyway. It doesn't really fix that. It doesn't give it like flying or anything or unblockable or whatever. Now it can attack and block a little more effectively with some spare mana. Still not a card you're like super excited to put in your deck. Very, very slight buff here. So those are the kind of unimportant ones. Let's get to the important ones here. Up next is Young Blue Dragon, Young Bleezy here. This is a huge change. Young Blue Dragon was probably the best blue common. But it wasn't saying much because it wasn't really that good. It was just okay. But now we see a point of toughness added. It was a 3-3 flyer. Now it's a 3-4 flyer. And this is a 2-for-1. You just cast Sand Augury. You draw a card. And you play the dragon later. That's just a natural 2-for-1. The problem with Young Blue Dragon was this is a pretty like on-the-board proactive format. And playing a card on turn 5 that would often need to block and trade down with like, 3-1s and 3-2s and stuff like that kind of sucked, honestly. So now this 4 point of toughness means that Young Blue Dragon can block all but the biggest commons, which is huge. So it affects the board much more of a turn you play it. And then once you get to untap with it safely in play after blocking and stabilizing, now you have a big flyer in play and you 2-for-1. So this is exactly the kind of thing you want to be doing. So this is a huge change. This helps a lot for blue. Very, very important. It looks small to see this like one number change here or there, but this is a big one. Don't sleep on Young Blue Dragon. Very, very good. The most interesting change here is actually a complete redesign of the card You Come to a River. This is the only redesign. Almost every other nerf or buff is a change of a number here and there, a mana cost here and there. But You Come to a River goes from being a 2-mana instant where Fight the Current's ability was to bounce a creature. Turn a creature to its owner's hand, yours or theirs. It changes to a sorcery, and now as the owner of target non-land permanent puts it on the top and bottom of their library. So now it goes from being a card disadvantage bounce spell, just like a pure tempo spell that can save your own creature, or just bounce their thing for tempo, to an actual like removal spell. This is a 1-for-1 removal spell because if you put the card on top of their library, they still have access to it, but they don't draw a card for that turn. So it's still a 1-for-1 exchange on resources, which is very important if you're trying to use it defensively. So a much better defensive card now. It's a sorcery, not an instant, which does matter. But as far as just like blue decks trying to stay alive, this card's really, really good against the double team 2-drops. You play this on turn 3, you hit their 2-drop before they can double team it. And now we're stuck like, do I want to draw this 2-drop on turn 3 or 4? Not really. So it's like kind of just a removal spell. Puts you in a spot where you're not just playing a blocker and having your blocker die and getting double teamed anyway. So it's not a great card by any means. Definitely a lot better than it was. Although there are some corner case scenarios where you might want the other card in general, but I think on average this card is better than it was and gives blue an actual removal spell. Not permanent, but at least something that can just affect the board and buy time to get to the mid and late game, which is a big change for blue. It's very, very important. Up next is Kenku Artificer. This change is almost irrelevant. This is a weird fringe card that animates artifacts. There aren't many artifacts in the set. It's now a 1-3 from a 1-1. Doesn't really affect the playability, honestly. It just is what it is. We get onto our specialized cards. Now, the blue specialized cards, almost every specialized card in the set is insanely good, except for the 2 blue ones, which are pretty mediocre. So you have the looting specialized card here. It changes from being a 2-1 to a 2-2 on the front side, and on the back side is a 4-4, not a 4-3. It's a change. This card wasn't great beforehand. It's okay if the game's really slow, but like a 2-1 looter for a 3 that can't block is not super exciting. Obviously, sizing up here is important, but a 2-2 isn't that much better than a 2-1 blocking 2 power creatures. So on the whole, not much of a change here. This is, again, still just kind of like a fringe card. You're not really super excited to play, although flipping it does make it a better body. It's 5 mana to flip, so kind of an and-one. And then we see Allura Rogue Companion. Very same idea. Going from a 3-2 on the front to a 3-3, and a 4-4 or a 4-3 on the back to a 4-4 on the back now. So now the fact this card can actually block a 2-power creature definitely makes it a little better, because the problem with these 2 cards is that they don't stabilize very well. You play them, they don't really affect the board because they can't block effectively. So you're kind of just like spending a turn off to hope this card is good. In a longer game that'll work, but in the fast tempo format that is this format, it doesn't work that well. So kind of helps a little bit, but doesn't really solve the problem with these cards. Just a very, very minor change. When we got to Goggles of Night, the goggles, they do nothing. Anyone?
Wow.
Not much of a change here. We see an equipment. Only change here is the equip cost goes down from 2 to 1. Wasn't a playable card beforehand. Still isn't really great either. Equipped creature does come in damage to a player, scry 1 and draw. Like, there's not really like a put this on your flyer and ride it out kind of deck in this format. So still not a very exciting card. We move on to perhaps one of the biggest changes in the entire release here. Guildsworn Prowler. There are 2 2-drops that swap to power and toughness, one a buff, one a nerf, and they are probably the most important changes. Guildsworn Prowler was one of the best black commons. It was a 2-1, now it is a 1-1. That could attack every turn. If your opponent ever blocked it, they always got 2 for 1. It was a super solid aggressive creature that could also play defense and get some value if they killed it. Now it's a 1-1, and it is almost none of those things. This card goes from being a top-tier common right down to, like, a fringy playable, more of a defensive card. Now, if you attack with it, they just take 1. Whatever, I'll take 1. I don't care. So they're very unlikely to block it and get you to 2 for 1. So for the most part, this is a blocking card and a synergy card. If you're playing Spectre Ghoul or Deadly Dispute, you can sacrifice it, get a little more value. And for the most part, this card has gone from top flight common to filler, which is a huge loss for black. Manticore here we see goes from being a 2-1 flyer to a 3-1 flyer. Same text otherwise. Does improve the card. This card was very, very fringe playable beforehand. Not a card you were super excited to play. Now it's a little better. 3 in the air is a much better clock. It now trades with more common flyers, which is important, but still kind of a fringy card. Not that big of a change. It's a very, very slight turn of a dial. Speaking of slight turn of a dial here, Baleful Beholder, exact same card. It is now a 7-5 instead of a 6-5. This is the concept of diminishing returns. Is a 7-5 bigger than a 6-5? Yes. Is it appreciably better? Not really. When you make your 1-1 into a 2-1, that's a huge change. It's a 50% increase in power. A 6 to a 7 is a percent increase. I'm not going to calculate, but it's not that much all in all. It's still basically the same card, just a tiny bit better. Not a card you're super excited to play regardless. However, a pretty big change here in Eyes of the Beholder. Eyes was a 6-mana removal spell, and it lost a mana now down to 5. At 5 mana, this card's pretty reasonable. If you're desperate for a kill spell, you could do better than this card, of course, but you could also do a lot worse. At 5 mana, 5 is much less than 6. If your opponent's playing a bomb, this is a good way to kill it. I could see in a best of 3 wanting to sideboard this card in if your opponent has a few extra bombs you want to get rid of. But as far as just killing, Dread Lenorns and bombs and things like that, this card does that. Not very efficiently, but it is an instant. It does do that. This card should go up in your pick order for sure. It's a lot better than it used to be. Still not great, but a lot better than it used to be. We see Sigil of Merkle here, which was a synergy enchantment that costs 3, now it costs 2. Beginning of combat, you mill a card. When you do, for former creature cards in your graveyard, put a counter on things. The graveyard deck did get a lot better, but this effect is still kind of eh. You're taking a turn off to cast it. You're hoping to get 4 creatures in your graveyard. You're only milling 1 card at a time. It's not really a great enabler or a great payoff, so, I mean, it's a little cheaper now, sure, but whatever. Moving on to Red. Young Reezy, Young Red Dragon, goes from being unplayable to reasonable. Originally had the text can't block and was a 3/2 flyer. And the text can't block is an abomination in Limited. You need to be able to play to the board every turn. And if the card you're playing can only attack and you are either even or behind, that's a huge loss. So before it was a pretty bad card, honestly. Now it is somewhat reasonable. If you're desperate for a dragon or desperate to splash and get the treasure, it's okay. Still mostly unplayable. I think I'm not happy to have this card in my deck unless I have some major dragon synergies or I need a mana fixer. So a little better now for sure than it was, but still not particularly great. And we see Dragonborn Immolator here. Kind of an interesting change. They changed the fire breathing ability from 2 mana to give +1/+0 to 3 mana to give +2/+0. So it's funny how this could be a nerf sometimes, because if you only have 2 mana and they have a 3/3 and you want to attack into it, you don't want to spend that extra mana, but it does go a little bigger. Either way, again, a very light change. Still not really a pretty exciting card. On raid here, we have a 2/4, a lot of mana to pump it. It's an okay ability. For the most part, this card's kind of unimpressive. You can play it, but you can do better for sure. Very, very light change. But we come to green, and we come to perhaps the biggest change of the entire set. Anthology change. Rebalances? Sure. Rebalances. Circle of a Land Druid was a 1/1 and is now a 2/1. Just like Guildsworn Prowl went from being a top flight common to like a kind of a mid-range filler. This card goes from being mid-range to almost unplayable, like Road Needs Help, to being probably one of the best green commons. 2 mana for a 2/1. When it ETBs mill 4, when it dies, get a land back. Now, because it actually has a body on it, it's a 2/1. Now it can trade with 2 drops, it can attack, and you're setting up that natural 2-for-1 where if they block it, you get to get your land back, most likely. And this is a really, really great thing because now it's a good card on rate. So that makes green better in general. And it also is a good card for the graveyard decks that weren't that good because now they're playing a card that's actually good on rate rather than just a card that is like pretty bad but works with the theme. Now they get a good card that also works with the theme. So this brings the Rising Tide on all graveyard cards up. Speaking of graveyard cards, we have Druidic Ritual here, which has changed from being able to return 1 creature and 1 land to either 2 creatures or 2 lands. So now, later in the game, you can mill over and get 2 creatures back, which is a pretty big change. Definitely a very grindy card. This is a pretty on-the-board format where you don't necessarily want, like, 3 mana draw 2 later in the game. But if you're playing a grindy green-black deck, this card can definitely work. Obviously, it's a bit of an enabler because it mills, and it can get lands earlier on, too. So, still not a crazy increase in power level here, but certainly a little more flexible. And as the graveyard deck gets a little bit better and the format slows down a little bit, it does improve overall as a card. It's not super exciting, but it's fine. Emerald Dragon here loses Trample and gains Ward 2. It's a very, very slight change for a 6 mana dragon. 4/4 flyer for 6, not really that good. And then Ward 2, at that point in the game, they're probably going to have extra mana to pay anyway. So very, very mild change here. It's a tiny bit better, but not that much better. Split the Spoils here. It used to cost 3, now it costs 2. This card's biggest problem was that there often weren't enough cards in the graveyard to actually use this. So it exiles 5 cards in the graveyard. You pile them up and you get the pile that your opponent wants to give you. In order to cast this card, you need to have 5 permanent cards you want in your graveyard, which is pretty hard. As the graveyard deck gets better, this is a little better. Now that it costs 2, you can double spell more easily, so you can cast this and play a card you got off of it. If you're like a really grindy green-black deck, if it becomes a thing, this could be a thing as well. But it's a pretty finicky card, even at 2 mana. So it doesn't really solve the problem of the card. But now we move on to white, and if you're a white mage, you are not going to be happy because they have nerfed some of the good white cards. White was the best color by like a lot, so it makes sense. So Steadfast Unicorn goes from an activation cost of 4 to an activation cost of 5. This is huge because one of the big things about Unicorn was threatening the pump on an attack and then double pumping. As you start to flood in the mid game, get up to 8 lands, you pump, and you win the game on the spot. So now that's not really possible because 10 mana is a ton to double pump. And of course, this is more of a now we're going to build our board, and now we're flooding out, and the board is stable. I'm going to activate this and try and push through. Then a trick I'm going to leave up, on turn 4 or turn 5. So definitely a worse card. You used to play a lot of these in your aggro decks. This is probably now a card you only want like one of, maybe even 0 if you're already like having good mana sinks and stuff like that. Much less exciting. It's still fine, but it goes from being a great common to being kind of like a mid-level fillery common. Then Blessed Hippogriff is the other one. This was the number 1 common in the entire set according to 17 lands data, and it gets a pretty big nerf, even though it doesn't look like much. The adventure cost of Tyr's Blessing goes from 1 white to 2 mana. Now, that might not sound like much. That's a big change. What made this card so frustrating was that Tyr's Blessing was impossible to play around. It was a 1 mana trick. At some point, you have to walk into it, and the cost was so low, your opponent would attack with their 2-drop. They would double team, you'd block it, they'd save their thing, and then play for 2-drop again. So it was always a tempo blowout. It was always a 2-for-1. And now it's not nearly as much of a tempo blowout. It's much easier to play around, despite still being a 2-for-1. This card is still good. It is no longer best common in a set good. It's probably not even top 3 white commons anymore. It's still a fine card, but this card and the Unicorn losing their efficiency is going to have a major ripple effect on all the white cards in the format, as far as the white decks just feeling so efficient. You're going to see a lot of this in the white decks. They're going to be all going to be a little bit worse, and mostly because of these 2 changes. Moving on to, this is the, I guess we're not in colors anymore. The Orb of Dragonkind changes. So every orb used to tap for the color that it was. So the red orb tap for red, the blue orb tap for blue, etc., etc. They've all been changed to tap for 1 mana of any color. This is actually huge, because these orbs were very, very awkward, because they were kind of clunky. They didn't fix your mana. The dragon deck would often want to be 3 colors, so it didn't really help you do that at all. They were just kind of like really clunky and awkward, whereas now they're actually reliable mana fixers, which is pretty sweet. And the green orb, probably the best one, gives counters on things. Blue's not very good, just offers scries, and the red offers haste. You probably want to be, either heavy on dragons or really wanting a mana rock to play these now, but at least they are playable because of the flexibility, which is pretty nice. So Jade Orb being the best by far, and the one that gained the most, because green also wants to ramp. But yeah, definitely a nice little buff here to cards that weren't really playable beforehand. Speaking of mana rocks, Lantern of Revealing goes from being a 4 mana activation to a 3 mana activation on the mana flood ability. Again, a slight buff. Again, 3 mana rock, there's more of these floating around, and with aggro being a little worse, ramping gets a little bit better, so a little more likely to play this card, although I don't think you're like playing or not playing this card based on the activated ability costing 1 less, just a slight buff to the card, which is reasonable. And then Navigation Orb gets a pretty big buff, actually. It costs 3, pay 1 to activate, you get to cultivate, but you also get to get gate cards as well, so if you have 1 or 2 gates in your deck, this thing goes up in value huge, as long as a good flood insurance. Again, it's kind of a clunky mana fixer, but if you're looking to have some card advantage and fixing in 1 card, this card's okay for that. Still not... Now it's gone from being pretty unplayable to a okay playable at 4 mana. 4 mana Cultivate is still okay, and again, with gates, you can specialize on the card advantage. So, that's it. 27 cards have been changed. Again, a lot of them aren't that big of changes. It's really interesting to see how the smaller changes are going to affect the format. Whereas, there's a few really big changes, but, how is the looter costing 1 going to affect things? Is that slight tweak from being, a 4 to a 5.5 going to make it more playable? How's that going to affect things? Every one of these changes will have a ripple effect, and we're going to see how that plays out. So I am pumped to get started with these drafts. My first episodes are going to be offline because I'm still offline on my ISP, but they'll be on YouTube, of course. So I'll see you on YouTube. Like, comment, subscribe. Let me know your thoughts on this, the thoughts on the rebalances and everything else, and I'll see you in the episode 18 of Bronze and Mythic, which will be starting, I guess, tomorrow. I've watched this on YouTube. So see you then.